There is a specific turning point in a Sigma male's life when the world he has been carrying finally becomes heavier than it should be. He starts noticing how much of his time has been given out of habit, how much of his energy has been drained by expectations he never agreed to, and how many obligations he accepted simply because it was easier than explaining why he didn't want them. This moment doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives with accuracy. It is the moment he realizes that solitude is not an escape from responsibility. It is the environment required to rebuild the version of himself that was buried under everyone else's needs. And once he steps into that solitude, everything he does next becomes deliberate. As he begins pulling away from relationships, routines, and emotional patterns that no longer fit him, something fundamental shifts. His clarity returns first, then his direction, and finally his identity. He no longer feels compelled to justify why he needs space, why certain people no longer have access to him, or why he has stopped showing up in places where he once felt obligated. What others interpret as disappearance is actually recalibration. He is removing the noise that drowned out his internal judgment, cutting emotional agreements he never consciously made, and giving himself permission to build a life that fits him instead of stretching himself to fit a life that never made sense. The rebirth begins the moment he stops performing roles that were assigned to him and starts choosing roles that align with who he has truly become. By the time he returns to the world, and he always does, he is unrecognizable in focus, discipline, and emotional independence. Not because he changed, but because he finally stopped resisting the person he was meant to be. Solitude becomes the forge, and rejecting obligation becomes the filter that reveals what deserves a place in his future. This is the Sigma male's rebirth. Not dramatic, not chaotic, but controlled, intentional, and irreversible. If you're someone who resonates with this transformation, subscribe to UltraWise, type Rebirth in the comments, and answer this. When was the moment you realized you were carrying a life that no longer belonged to you? He stops living by obligations that were never his choice, and starts building a life based on alignment, not expectation. He reaches a moment where the weight of inherited obligations becomes impossible to ignore. The subtle expectations from family, society, relationships, and past versions of himself that were silently shaping his behavior. For years, he followed paths he didn't choose, carried responsibilities placed on him without consent, and accepted roles that never matched the person he was becoming. But the turning point in a Sigma's rebirth arrives when he finally questions who actually benefits from those obligations. That question doesn't spark rebellion, it sparks clarity. He sees, perhaps for the first time, that living by expectation is a slow erosion of identity, and that every forced duty pulls him further away from his authentic direction. That realization begins to rewrite everything. As he pulls back from the noise, he begins auditing his life with ruthless honesty. What aligns stays. What drains leaves. He no longer acts to be approved, admired, or understood. He acts because the choice fits his inner architecture. This shift is subtle from the outside, but seismic within. He stops replying out of habit. He stops showing up out of guilt. He stops giving his energy to commitments that were written before he had the power to choose. And when he breaks those invisible contracts, something unexpected happens. The internal pressure dissolves. His mind steadies. His purpose sharpens. The world that once felt heavy starts to feel negotiable. For the first time, he's not reacting to life, he's designing it. This rebuilding doesn't make him colder, it makes him truer. He starts choosing environments that match his pace, relationships that respect his boundaries, and goals that align with who he is rather than who others want him to be. His decisions become quieter but more powerful, guided by internal resonance rather than external approval. And as his life shifts from obligation to alignment, something remarkable emerges. A version of himself that feels natural, grounded, and fully in control. Not because he discovered something new, but because he finally stopped living according to expectations that were never his to carry. He withdraws from draining environments to restore his mental clarity and emotional autonomy. There comes a point when he can no longer ignore the subtle erosion happening inside him. The way certain environments drain him without making a sound, the way certain people pull from him more than they ever give, and the way constant stimulation slowly buries his own thoughts beneath the noise of everyone else's expectations. His withdrawal doesn't begin with a dramatic exit. It begins with a quiet recognition that clarity cannot exist in places that demand his energy but never nourish it. So he steps back, not to punish anyone, but to reclaim the parts of himself that were being diluted. In solitude, his mind finally stops absorbing the emotional static around him, and he can hear his own internal signal again. That silence becomes the ground zero of his rebirth. As he distances himself from draining spaces, he begins to understand how deeply he had been shaped by the environments he tolerated. Rooms that once felt normal now reveal themselves as cages. Conversations he used to endure now sound like noise. Obligations that once felt unavoidable suddenly look optional. The absence of constant pull gives him something he had forgotten he needed: autonomy over his emotional state. In that autonomy, he recalibrates. He processes what he has been carrying. He untangles the tension he kept ignoring. His internal compass, once distorted by the demands of others, realigns, pointing him back toward the person he was before he became exhausted by expectations he never agreed to. The more distance he creates, the clearer the truth becomes. And as clarity returns, so does strength. He becomes protective of his mental environment the way others protect their physical space. He stops allowing access to people who confuse his calm for availability. He stops explaining why he needs space because the reason is simple. He cannot grow where he is being drained. His withdrawal becomes a ritual of self-preservation, a sharpening of identity, and a reminder that freedom begins with the environments he chooses or refuses to remain in. When he returns, he is no longer the man shaped by noise. He is the man shaped by clarity, solitude, and a renewed sense of emotional sovereignty. He breaks the invisible contracts that kept him responsible for other people's comfort. For most of his life, he carried agreements he never consciously accepted, unspoken roles that cast him as the steady one, the understanding one, the one who absorbs tension so others don't have to feel it. These invisible contracts were signed not with words, but with patterns. Every time he stayed calm while someone else exploded. Every time he listened while no one asked how he was doing. Every time he was expected to be available simply because he always had been. Eventually, the weight of those contracts becomes undeniable. He realizes that responsibility for other people's comfort has been disguising itself as loyalty, as kindness, as strength. And the moment he sees that truth clearly, something fundamental shifts. Instead of adjusting himself to protect others from discomfort, he steps back and lets the discomfort be theirs to carry. It is not rebellion, it is correction. As he breaks these unspoken agreements, the changes are subtle at first. He stops cushioning his words to protect fragile egos. He stops filling silence just to ease someone else's anxiety. He stops offering reassurance that he no longer has the emotional bandwidth to provide. The people around him feel the shift, but they can't explain it. They only sense that their emotional weight no longer lands where it used to. And in that shift, he reclaims something sacred. the right to prioritize his own internal world instead of performing for the emotional stability of others. These contracts had shaped him into a quiet guardian of harmony, a keeper of peace at his own expense. Breaking them returns him to himself. With every invisible contract he dissolves, he becomes lighter, more grounded, and more authentic. He stops feeling guilty for choosing himself because he finally understands the cost of not doing so. And as he withdraws from roles he never chose, he becomes clearer about who he actually wants to be, not the dependable emotional buffer people relied on, but a man who operates from alignment instead of obligation. This release isn't dramatic or vengeful. It is precise and deeply intentional. He no longer agrees to carry what was never his burden. And in that freedom, his identity sharpens, his boundaries harden, and the world begins to treat him according to the worth he no longer hides. He rebuilds his identity in solitude, free from external influence or judgment. When he finally steps away from the noise, something profound happens. The world that once pulled at him from every direction goes silent, and for the first time in years, he can hear the sound of his own thinking without interruption. Solitude becomes a mirror, a laboratory, a recalibration chamber, where the expectations of others no longer distort who he is allowed to be. In that quiet space, he begins dismantling the versions of himself he built for survival: the agreeable son, the reliable friend, the unshakable partner, the peacekeeper who swallowed his own needs so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. With each layer he strips away, he uncovers a self that never had room to fully exist. What he rebuilds in that solitude is not a performance, it is a reconstruction of truth. As the days pass, independence sharpens his perception. He notices the subtle ways external opinions once shaped his behavior, the way he held his tongue to avoid being misunderstood, the way he dimmed his ambition to avoid threatening anyone, the way he softened his strength to fit into environments that didn't deserve it. In solitude, all of those compromises lose their power. He no longer edits his thoughts to be digestible. He no longer dilutes his vision to be acceptable. The absence of judgment becomes a creative force, giving him permission to evolve without justification. This is where his internal architecture resets. This is where his identity becomes his own again. By the time he emerges from this phase, he carries a different presence, grounded, unshaken, and internally aligned. People sense the difference before he says a word. He no longer seeks validation because he rebuilt himself without requiring it. He no longer fears being misunderstood because his direction is rooted in self-awareness, not approval. Solitude did not isolate him, it refined him. And the man who returns from it is not a quieter version of who he was. He is a clearer, stronger, more deliberate version who finally belongs to himself. He removes the roles he was forced into and replaces them with roles he consciously chooses. There comes a moment when he finally sees the truth. Most of the roles he carried were never chosen. They were assigned. The dependable one, the fixer, the silent supporter, the emotional anchor, the person who absorbed tension so others could stay comfortable. For years, he moved through life playing characters written by family, partners, friends, and environments that never asked who he actually wanted to be. But once he steps back into solitude and the fog begins to clear, he recognizes how those roles shaped his behavior more than his authentic desires ever did. That realization becomes the beginning of an internal rebellion. Not loud, not dramatic, but precise and irreversible. He starts by stripping away everything that feels borrowed, the responsibilities that were handed to him without consent, the expectations that clung to him simply because he was capable, calm, or emotionally intelligent. He lets them fall away one by one, not out of anger, but out of alignment. In their place, he begins constructing roles that serve his growth instead of suppressing it. the role of the creator instead of the caretaker, the strategist instead of the stabilizer, the man who chooses where his energy goes instead of being dragged by obligation. For the first time, he designs his identity around vision rather than obligation. And with each conscious choice, his sense of self becomes sharper, cleaner, more intentional. People around him feel the shift long before he explains it, because his responses change, his boundaries strengthen, and his direction becomes unmistakably his own. He no longer jumps in to fix problems that aren't his. He no longer carries emotional weight that was never meant to be on his shoulders. He stops performing versions of himself just to meet expectations he never agreed to. And as these old roles crumble, a new identity emerges, one built from clarity, autonomy, and self-defined purpose. He becomes a man who decides who he is instead of inheriting it. And that transformation is not just growth, it is liberation. He returns to the world with sharper boundaries, stronger self-respect, and uncompromising standards. When he steps back into the world after a period of solitude, he does not return as the same man who left. The version of him that once tolerated imbalance, disrespect, or emotional chaos no longer exists. His boundaries are no longer soft suggestions. They are structural, deliberate lines drawn from clarity, not anger. Where he once hesitated to say no, he now does so without apology. Where he once absorbed the weight of others' emotions, he now filters access with precision. And the shift is unmistakable. He moves differently, speaks differently, chooses differently. Not louder, not colder, but cleaner, more defined. The world feels the change before he even explains it. This new self-respect acts like a silent force field. He no longer entertains half-effort or inconsistent behavior. He no longer negotiates for a place in anyone's life. He no longer bends to avoid disappointing others. His value is no longer up for debate, not because he declares it, but because everything about him communicates it. Conversations become more intentional. Interactions become more selective. His time is guarded like a resource, not an afterthought. And the people who once benefited from his lack of boundaries feel a quiet discomfort because the access they once had is now earned, not assumed. This transformation is not about becoming harder, it's about becoming aligned. As he re-enters the world, he carries a subtle but undeniable authority. The authority of a man who finally knows his worth. He expects reciprocity, honesty, and emotional maturity, and anyone who cannot offer that simply fades from his orbit. His standards are no longer negotiable because they are no longer reactionary. They are foundational to who he is becoming. He walks forward with calm confidence, grounded purpose, and a refined sense of self that cannot be manipulated, diluted, or redirected. This is not a return. It is an arrival. A rebirth into a life that fits him, not one he was guilted into carrying. His transformation makes him unrecognizable, not because he changed, but because he finally stopped hiding who he truly is. The world notices the difference immediately, but they can't explain it. His posture, his silence, his presence, all of it feels sharpened, clarified, stripped of the old weight he carried. Yet the truth is far simpler than people assume. He didn't reinvent himself. He removed everything that once forced him to shrink. For years, he learned to dim parts of his identity to keep the peace, to fit into expectations that never matched him, to avoid the discomfort of being misunderstood. But once he steps into his rebirth, those old layers fall away. What emerges is not a new version of him, but the original one, unfiltered, undiluted, unmasked. The power people now see was always there, just buried beneath responsibility, guilt, or survival habits he no longer carries. This unmasking makes him appear almost unfamiliar. His boundaries are firm, his standards precise, his emotional clarity unwavering.
People who once relied on his softness, his availability, or his silence suddenly realize those were not his defining traits. They were coping mechanisms shaped by environments that demanded too much from him and offered too little in return.
Now he speaks less but means more. He listens selectively, not passively. He moves with intentionality instead of obligation. Those who knew only the watered-down version of him feel disoriented, as if they're meeting a stranger wearing a familiar face. But this time, he isn't bending to make others comfortable. He isn't shrinking to maintain harmony. His identity finally stands on its full height. And this is why his transformation feels so dramatic. It exposes how much of his authentic self was hidden, even from those closest to him. When he stops hiding, his intelligence becomes clearer, his emotional depth becomes more visible, and his independence becomes undeniable. He takes up the space he always deserved. The shift is not loud or theatrical, it is controlled, grounded, and deeply intentional. He becomes someone who cannot be underestimated, manipulated, or overlooked. Not because he changed who he is, but because he finally granted himself permission to exist without disguise. In the end, his rebirth isn't a dramatic announcement, it's a quiet reclamation of everything he once gave away too easily. When he stops hiding his true identity, the world doesn't just see a stronger version of him. It sees the version that was always meant to lead his life, not survive it. And that shift radiates into every decision he makes, every boundary he holds, every connection he chooses with intention instead of obligation. This is the moment his life aligns, not with expectations, but with truth. If this resonated with you, make sure you subscribe to UltraWise so you don't miss the next deep dive into the psychology behind quiet power and self-transformation. And now a question for you. What's the one thing you stopped hiding that changed your life the most? Drop the word reborn in the comments so I know you made it to the end.